The room went silent when they said my name, and I remember thinking how strange it was that silence could feel louder than any applause because just 3 hours earlier that same room, or at least a different one filled with the same people, had been full of laughter and clinking glasses and my father's voice cutting through everything like it always did, except this time it wasn't a joke, it was a verdict. "You're useless, Noah," he said across the Christmas dinner table, like he was commenting on the weather, and not dismantling a person in front of 12 relatives who suddenly found their plates very interesting or their wine glasses desperately empty. And I didn't say anything, not because I agreed, but because I'd learned a long time ago that in my family silence was safer than defense, because defense only invited more proof, more examples, more comparisons. And there was always one comparison that mattered: my sister Emily. Perfect Emily, Harvard MBA Emily, who had just closed a mid-6-figure deal and made sure everyone knew it, because that's how things worked in our house. Success wasn't just celebrated, it was measured, displayed, ranked like some invisible scoreboard that I had been losing on for as long as I could remember. And that night was no different. The tree was lit, the table was set with my mom's best china, the kind she only used twice a year, and the air smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon and everything that was supposed to mean comfort. But to me it just felt like a stage, because that's what it always turned into, eventually a performance where Emily shined and I filled space until someone decided I'd taken up too much of it. "So, Noah," my uncle said halfway through dinner, leaning back in his chair with that half smile that always meant trouble, "what exactly do you do again?" And there it was, the question I'd heard 100 different ways over the years, dressed up as curiosity, but always carrying the same weight. I could feel everyone's attention shift. Just slightly, not obvious enough to call out, but enough that I knew this was my moment to either impress or confirm what they already believed, and I chose honesty like I always did, even though it never worked. "I'm working on a startup," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We're in the middle of closing a deal right now," and for a split second, I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe the word deal would land differently. Maybe someone would ask a real question. Maybe I'd get 5 seconds of actual interest. But instead, my dad let out a short laugh. Not loud, not explosive, just enough to redirect the energy of the table back to something familiar: a deal. He repeated like it was a foreign word he didn't quite trust. "How big is this one, Noah?" $50. A few people chuckled, not cruelly, not even intentionally, but it didn't matter. Laughter is laughter when you're the punchline, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that used to make me argue back when I was younger, when I still thought I could win these moments with enough explanation, enough detail, enough proof. But that version of me had been retired years ago, replaced by someone who understood that in this room logic didn't matter, narrative did. And my role in their narrative had already been written. "It's still in progress," I said, which was true, just not the whole truth, and Emily leaned in right on cue, because she always knew when to step forward, like she could sense the spotlight drifting and couldn't let it stay anywhere else for too long. "Dad, leave him alone," she said, smiling, but not at me, more like she was managing the room. "Not everyone needs to build something huge right away. Some people take longer to figure things out." And that word, "some people," hung in the air heavier than anything my dad had said, because it sounded kinder, but somehow felt worse, like being dismissed gently instead of directly, like being placed in a category you couldn't climb out of. And I nodded like I appreciated the defense, because that's what was expected, but inside something shifted just slightly, not anger, not even hurt, just a quiet recalibration, like a line being drawn somewhere deeper than emotion. And then my mom added her part, because she always did. "We just worry about you, Noah," she said softly. "You're almost 30 and you're still exploring." Exploring like I was on some extended vacation instead of working 18-hour days building something they'd never taken the time to understand. And I looked down at my plate, pushing food around that I couldn't taste anymore, and I remember thinking how predictable it all was, how every year had some version of this conversation, like a tradition no one acknowledged, but everyone participated in. And then my dad leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table, looking directly at me. This time, no humor, no softness, just that same straightforward tone he used when he thought he was being honest. "At some point," he said, "you've got to face reality, son. You can't keep chasing things that aren't going anywhere. You're not a kid anymore. You need to be useful." And there it was, the word that would echo in my head for the next 3 hours: useless. Not said loudly, not even aggressively, just stated like a fact, like something that had already been decided, and I felt every eye at the table flicker toward me, and then away, waiting for a reaction that I didn't give, because I had learned that reacting only made it last longer. So instead, I picked up my glass, took a sip of water, and nodded once, like I was accepting feedback in a meeting and not being reduced in my own family's home. "You're right," I said quietly, and that surprised them more than anything else, because I never agreed before. I used to push back, argue, explain, but not this time. This time, I let it land exactly where they wanted it to land, and I stood up a minute later, excusing myself like I needed some air, which wasn't a lie, but also wasn't the full reason, because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, sitting around that table measuring my worth against numbers they could understand, was that the deal I mentioned wasn't hypothetical, it wasn't small, and it definitely wasn't going nowhere. It was already in motion, contracts drafted, numbers finalized, a $12 million acquisition that had taken me 2 years to build quietly, piece by piece, without their validation, without their interest, without their belief. And as I stepped outside into the cold December air, I pulled out my phone and saw the message I'd been waiting for all day, just one line from my partner: "It's done, see you at the event tonight." And I stood there for a second reading it again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to feel it fully, without interruption, without commentary, without comparison, just for myself. And then I put my phone away, took a breath, and looked back through the window at the table, where my family was still sitting, still talking, still laughing, still completely certain about who I was and who I wasn't. And I remember thinking, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a strange kind of clarity: they have no idea what's about to happen. I did not go back inside right away. I stood there for a few more seconds, letting the cold settle into my skin, because it felt clearer out there, quieter, like the world was not trying to define me every second. And for the first time that night, I was not thinking about what they said. I was thinking about what was already done. The contract had been signed an hour ago, while I was sitting at that table pretending to care about a conversation that had already decided my place in the room. And there was something almost ironic about that, the timing of it, the way everything had aligned, like two completely different versions of reality running side by side, one where I was still the disappointment, and another where I had just closed the biggest deal of my life, and neither of those worlds had touched yet, but they were about to. I walked back inside slowly, not rushing, not trying to escape anymore, because now there was nothing to escape from. The conversation had moved on by the time I sat down. Again, my dad was talking about interest rates and real estate trends, something he always circled back to like it was the only language that mattered. And Emily was adding her thoughts, nodding at the right moments, reinforcing everything he said. And I could see it so clearly now, the pattern, the alignment, the way they reflected each other's certainty, like it was fact, and not just perspective. "You should think about getting into something stable," my dad said again, not even looking at me this time, like the conversation was more about principle than about me specifically, something that actually builds long-term value. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly timed. I had spent the last 2 years building something long-term, something real, something that did not rely on their approval or even their awareness. And yet here, he was explaining value to me like I had never considered it. "I will," I said simply, and that was enough for them. That was always enough. Agreement, or at least the appearance of it, because it kept things comfortable, it kept the structure intact, and comfort was always the priority in this house, not truth, not understanding, just the absence of conflict. And I had learned to give them that, because it cost me less than fighting ever did. Dinner ended the way it always did. Plates cleared, conversations splitting into smaller groups, my mom moving between the kitchen and the table, making sure everything felt complete, and I helped quietly, carrying dishes, stacking glasses, doing the small things I had always done, because usefulness in that form was always acceptable. It was the larger kind that they never recognized. "You okay?" my cousin Mark asked, as we stood by the sink rinsing plates, his voice low enough that it did not carry. "Yeah," I said without hesitation, because I was not going to explain it, not tonight, not here. And he nodded like he understood, or at least like he respected the answer. And that was enough. After everything was cleaned up, I checked my phone again. One more message, this time from the event coordinator: "Stage call in 30 minutes, where are you?" And I typed back, "On my way," before I could overthink it, because that was the moment everything shifted, not emotionally, not dramatically, just a decision point where I stopped being the version of myself they were used to and stepped fully into the one I had been building in private. I grabbed my coat, said a quick goodbye, nothing long, nothing that invited more conversation, and my mom gave me that familiar look, the one that mixed concern with quiet disappointment, like she was watching a story play out that she already believed she understood. "Drive safe," she said, and I nodded because that was easier than explaining anything, and I walked out the door again, this time not pausing, not looking back, because I knew exactly where I was going. The venue was across town, a downtown hotel ballroom converted for the event, lights already set, cameras in place, people gathering in clusters of conversation that sounded different, sharper, more intentional, like everyone there was speaking in terms of opportunity instead of comparison. And as I stepped inside, I felt that shift immediately. The way the room did not question my presence, it expected it. One of the coordinators spotted me right away, walking over with a clipboard and a focused expression. "Noah, glad you made it. We are about to start. You will be introduced after the second segment." I nodded, taking in the room, the stage, the screens. The quiet anticipation building in a completely different way than anything I had just left behind, and for a second I thought about the dinner table, the laughter, the word useless, and how small it felt now, not insignificant, but contained, like it belonged to a different version of the night, one that had already ended, even if they did not know it yet. "Everything is set?" I asked, and she smiled slightly. "Everything is set." And I took a breath, not to calm down, but to center myself, because this was not about proving them wrong, not really. It was about stepping into something that had been real long before they ever had the chance to see it. And as the lights dimmed slightly, and the host walked onto the stage, beginning the introduction, I found my place just off to the side, waiting for the moment when those two worlds would finally collide. The host's voice carried across the room with that polished confidence that made everything feel larger than it was, and for a moment, I just stood there listening as he spoke about growth, innovation, vision, all the words people use when they want to make something sound inevitable, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not wondering if I belonged in that room. I knew I did. "Tonight we are recognizing a deal that has been quietly developing over the past 2 years, he said, and I felt that phrase land. Quietly developing, because that was exactly how it had happened, not loud, not public, not validated by anyone who had once decided I was behind. I built it in early mornings and late nights, in small conference rooms and long calls that no one in my family had ever asked about. And as he continued speaking, the screens behind him lit up with the company name, the numbers, the structure of the acquisition, $12 million displayed, clean and undeniable, not exaggerated, not dressed up, just real and measurable in the language they had always respected. And then he said the line that shifted everything: "Please join me in welcoming the founder and lead on this deal, Noah Bennett." And for a split second there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just that same silence I had felt earlier, except this time it was not heavy, it was open, like space waiting to be filled, and I stepped forward into the light, not quickly, not dramatically, just steady, because this moment had already happened in my head 100 times during the past 2 years, not as revenge, not as proof, but as a quiet checkpoint that I had promised myself I would reach. And as I walked onto the stage, I could see the audience more clearly, rows of faces, some familiar, some not, all focused in a way that felt different from the attention at the dinner table. This was not curiosity, this was recognition, and somewhere in the back of the room, near one of the round tables, I saw them, my family sitting together, my mom leaning slightly forward like she was trying to understand what she was seeing, my dad completely still, his posture unchanged, but his expression no longer certain, and Emily looking directly at me, not smiling, not reacting, just processing. And I realized in that moment that they had not followed the same timeline I had for them. This was new information, a different version of reality arriving all at once, without warning, without context. And I did not rush to fill that gap. I took the microphone, thanked the host, and let a brief pause settle, not for effect, but because I wanted to be present in it, fully aware of where I was and how far that distance had actually been. This deal started as a small idea 2 years ago, I said, my voice even not louder than necessary. It grew because a lot of people believed in it before it made sense to believe in it. And I meant that not as a contrast to my family, but as a simple acknowledgement of the people who had shown up early, the ones who had asked questions instead of making conclusions. And as I spoke, I kept my tone measured, not performative, not exaggerated, because I was not there to impress them. I was there to state something real, something that did not depend on their reaction to exist. And I could feel the room listening in a different way now, not waiting for a mistake, not searching for a weakness, just following along. And when I finished, I handed the microphone back with a small nod. No extended speech, no dramatic ending, because the point had already been made, the numbers had already spoken, and as I stepped off the stage, the coordinator met me with a quick smile. "That was perfect," She said, and I nodded once because I was not thinking about perfect. I was thinking about alignment, about how everything had finally intersected in a single moment that required no explanation. And then I turned slightly, looking back toward the audience again, and I could see them more clearly now. My mom standing up halfway, like she was unsure whether to approach my dad, still seated but no longer leaning back, his hands clasped together in front of him, and Emily watching me with a look I had not seen before, not superiority, not dismissal, just uncertainty, like she was recalculating something that had always seemed fixed. And I did not walk toward them right away. I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer, letting that space exist, because this was not a scene I needed to control. It was one they needed to understand, and for the first time in my life, I was not trying to fit into the version of me they had created. I was simply standing in the version I had built and letting them catch up. My mom was the first to reach me, and she did not rush the way she usually did when she was trying to smooth something over. Instead, she stopped a few feet away, like she needed a second to match what she had just seen with what she thought she knew about me. Noah, she said quietly, and there was something different in her voice, not just surprise but hesitation, like she was choosing each word more carefully than she ever had before. I did not know, and I nodded once, not because I expected her to know, but because that was the truth they had never asked. Not really, and I had stopped offering a long time ago. My dad approached, next slower, more deliberate, his posture still carrying that same authority, but without the certainty that used to come with it. He looked at me for a moment, like he was trying to find the right version of me to speak to, the one from earlier that night, or the one standing in front of him now. 12 million. He said finally, not as a question, but as a statement, like he was confirming the number to himself, and I nodded again. Yes, and that was enough for a brief silence to settle between us, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, because for once there was nothing to correct, nothing to advise, nothing to compare. The data point stood on its own, and he could not immediately reposition it into the narrative he was used to. You should have told us, he said after a moment, and I could hear the edge of something in that sentence. Not anger, not exactly, more like a need to re-establish structure, to find a way to make sense of it in terms that kept him in control of the conversation. And I shook my head slightly. I tried before, I said calmly. I just stopped when I realized it did not land. And I did not say it to challenge him. I said it because it was true, and because for the first time, I was not filtering that truth to make it easier for anyone else to hear. Emily stepped closer, then her expression still focused, but different from anything I had seen growing up. She was not evaluating me anymore. She was studying the situation, like she was trying to understand how something had developed without her noticing. What kind of company is it? She asked, and it was the first real question anyone in my family had asked me about what I was building in 2 years, and I almost paused on that, not because I did not want to answer, but because I wanted to recognize what it represented, a shift, however small, from assumption to curiosity. We build logistics software for mid-sized distribution companies, I said. We help them reduce costs and improve delivery timelines. And she nodded slowly, like she was mapping that against what she already knew about business. And for once, she did not follow it with a comparison or a qualification. She just absorbed it. That is actually smart, she said, and there was no sarcasm in it, no underlying tone, just a straightforward acknowledgement. And my dad exhaled slightly, crossing his arms in a way that felt more reflective than defensive. You did all this without any outside funding? He asked, and I shook my head. We started small, then brought in partners once we had traction, and I kept my answer simple. Not because there was not more to say, but because this was not a presentation, this was a recalibration of something much deeper, and I could feel it happening in real time, the way their questions shifted, the way their tone adjusted, the way the certainty that had defined me for them was being replaced by something less fixed, more open. And it was strange to stand there in the middle of that, not triumphant, not vindicated, just aware that this was the first time we were all looking at the same reality from the same point in time. You should come by the office sometime, my dad said after a pause, and it was almost automatic the way he framed it, like an invitation, but also like a way to reconnect things to his world, his structure, his understanding of how success should look. And I nodded once. Maybe, I said, not committing, not rejecting, just leaving it where it was, because I was not trying to move backward into a dynamic that had never worked. I was standing in something new, and I needed to see if they could meet me there without reshaping it into something familiar. My mom reached out, then placing her hand lightly on my arm. We are proud of you, She said, and I looked at her for a second longer than I had earlier that night, because that sentence carried weight now, not because of what it meant to me, but because of how long it had taken to arrive, and I believed that she meant it, but I also knew that meaning it now did not erase what had been said before, and I did not need it to. I just nodded once again, accepting it without attaching anything else to it, and then there was a small pause where no one spoke, where the noise of the room filled in the space around us, conversations continuing, glasses clinking, people moving on to the next part of their evening, while we stood there in the middle of something that had quietly shifted. And I realized then that this moment was not about proving anything, it was about clarity, about seeing things as they actually were, without the distortion of old expectations. And as I stepped slightly back, creating just a bit of space between us, I understood something I had not fully seen before. I did not need them to change their view of me to move forward. I had already moved, and whether they followed or not was no longer something that defined where I was going. The conversation around us slowly dissolved back into the rhythm of the event, people returning to their own discussions as if nothing had happened, and in a way nothing had, at least not for them. But for me, something had shifted permanently, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, irreversible one, like a line that once crossed does not move back. My dad was still standing there, his arms now relaxed at his sides, his posture no longer defensive, but not entirely open either, like he was still deciding how to engage with this new version of me. "You built this from scratch," he said after a moment, and this time it sounded less like an evaluation and more like a realization, and I nodded. "Yeah." And he looked down briefly, then back up at me, and I could see it happening, the recalculation, the attempt to align this outcome with everything he thought he understood about effort, value, and results. "That takes discipline," he added, and it was subtle, but it mattered because it was the first time he had attributed something positive to my process without immediately comparing it to someone else or qualifying it with a doubt, and I acknowledged it with a small nod, not because I needed the validation, but because I recognized the shift. Emily stepped slightly closer, her voice lower, now more private. "Why did you not say anything earlier?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it, just curiosity, and I took a second before answering, not to filter, but to choose the most honest version of the truth, because every time I tried it turned into something else. I said it became a comparison or a correction or a joke, so I decided to just build it instead, and she held my gaze for a second longer than usual, like she was absorbing not just the words, but what they implied about the past, the conversations, the assumptions, and then she nodded once slowly. "That makes sense," she said, and for a moment that simple acknowledgement carried more weight than any praise could have, because it meant she understood something she had not seen before. My mom was still standing beside me, her hand now resting lightly against her arm, like she was holding herself in place. "We missed a lot," she said quietly, and I could hear the sincerity in it, not exaggerated, not emotional, just a clear recognition, and I did not rush to respond because there was nothing to correct, nothing to soften. It was simply true. "Yeah," I said after a second, "you did." And I did not say it to hurt her, I said it because I was no longer interested in protecting a version of reality that had already proven itself incomplete, and she nodded slowly, like she accepted that without trying to adjust it or explain it away, and that in itself felt different, the absence of defense, the willingness to just let it be what it was. "We would like to understand it now," she added, and I looked at her, then at my dad, then at Emily, and for the first time I saw something that had not been there before, not authority, not expectation, but openness, not fully formed, not perfect, but present, and I considered that for a moment, because this was the part that mattered more than the stage, more than the deal, more than the number. This was about whether something could actually change, or if this would just become another story they told themselves later, reshaped to fit the same old pattern. "We can talk," I said finally, "but it has to be different." And my dad nodded almost immediately, like he understood what that meant, even if he did not have the language for it yet. "It will be," he said, and I did not challenge that, not because I believed it fully, but because I was willing to see if it could be true on different terms, not the ones we had been using for years, but something new, something that did not rely on hierarchy or comparison to function. The coordinator approached again, briefly reminding me about a follow-up segment, and I nodded, letting her know I would be there in a few minutes, and as she walked away, I looked back at my family one more time, not searching, not waiting, just observing the way they stood, the way they held themselves, the way they were adjusting to something they had not prepared for, And I realized something else, then something even quieter than everything that had already shifted. I was not standing there for them anymore. I was standing there for myself. And whether they joined me in that space or stayed where they had always been was no longer something that controlled how I moved forward. I have to get back, I said, and my mom nodded, stepping slightly back. My dad gave a short nod as well, and Emily held my gaze for a second before offering a small, almost thoughtful smile, and as I turned and walked back toward the stage area, I did not feel lighter or heavier. I felt clear, like everything was exactly where it needed to be, not resolved, not finished, but aligned in a way that made sense. And as the lights shifted again, and the next segment began, I took my place, knowing that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been said at a dinner table hours ago, but by what I had already built in the time they were not looking. The next segment moved quickly, a panel discussion about market expansion and operational scale, voices overlapping in a rhythm that felt familiar to the room, but distant to me because my focus had shifted entirely. I was no longer thinking about the presentation or the deal, or even the people on stage. I was thinking about what came after, not the event, not the conversations, but the space that had opened up between who I had been in that house and who I was standing as now, and how that space was no longer something I needed to close. The moderator asked a question about long-term strategy, and one of the panelists gave a detailed answer full of projections and forecasts, and I listened just enough to stay present, but not enough to get pulled into it, because for the first time I was not measuring myself against the room. I was simply part of it, and that difference was subtle but complete. When the segment ended, the applause came again, steady and expected, and I stepped aside, letting the next speaker take the stage. And as I did, I saw my dad again. This time, he was not standing still. He was talking to someone, one of the executives I recognized from earlier, his posture slightly adjusted, his tone more measured, like he was aligning himself with a conversation he respected. And for a second I watched that, not with judgment but with recognition, because I understood that instinct, the need to reposition, to find footing in a space that had shifted. And then he glanced toward me just briefly, and there was no signal, no gesture, just a look that held longer than before. And I nodded once, not as approval, not as acknowledgement, just as a simple connection. And he returned it with the same small motion, and then turned back to his conversation. My mom was seated now, speaking with one of the event staff, her expression softer, more relaxed, like the initial shock had settled into something she could process. And Emily was standing near the edge of the room, her phone in her hand, but not really looking at it, her attention drifting back toward the stage, and then to me. And I could tell she was thinking, not reacting, not comparing, just thinking. And that was new. Later, as the event began to wind down, people started to move more freely, conversations breaking into smaller circles, cards being exchanged, plans being made for follow-ups. And I stepped out toward the hallway for a moment, away from the noise, not because I needed space, but because I wanted clarity. And as I stood there, I thought back, not to the dinner, not to the comment, but to everything in between: the early mornings, the uncertainty, the moments where nothing was guaranteed, and the only thing I had was the decision to keep going. And I realized that none of that had changed because of what happened tonight. The deal did not validate that work, it simply reflected it, and the difference mattered because it meant that what I had built was not dependent on this moment or their reaction or anyone else's recognition. It stood on its own and would continue to do so after the lights were off and the room was empty. Noah. I turned and saw Emily walking toward me, her pace steady, not rushed, and when she stopped in front of me, she did not start with a statement. She started with a question. "Are you staying in the city tonight?" she asked, and it was a simple question, but it carried something underneath it, not assumption, not expectation, just an opening. "Yeah," I said. "I have a meeting in the morning." And she nodded like she had expected that. "Do you want to get coffee before you leave?" she asked, and for a second I considered it, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand what that invitation meant, not in words, but in intention. And I could see it clearly now. She was not asking as the version of herself that always led. She was asking as someone who wanted to meet me where I was without reshaping it into something she controlled. "Sure," I said after a moment, "that works." And she gave a small nod, not overemphasizing it, not turning it into something bigger than it was, just accepting it as a next step. And as she walked back toward the main room, I stayed there for another second longer, just taking in the quiet of the hallway, the absence of noise, the absence of expectation. And I realized something that settled deeper than anything else that night. This was not the end of anything. It was the Beginning of a different kind of conversation, one that had not existed before, not because it could not, but because it had never been allowed to. And as I walked back toward the room, rejoining the flow of the event, I did not feel like I had proven anything. I felt like I had finally removed the need to. By the time the event started to thin out, the energy in the room had shifted from presentation to negotiation, people leaning closer, voices lower, conversations more focused, and I moved through it naturally now, not searching for validation, not trying to prove anything, just engaging where it made sense, stepping away where it did not, and it felt different from anything I had experienced before because there was no tension behind it, no need to perform or defend. There was just clarity, and that clarity followed me all the way out of the venue. When I finally stepped into the night air again, the city quieter now, the streets reflecting the glow of streetlights and passing cars, and for a moment, I just stood there taking it in, not because I needed to process what had happened, but because I wanted to recognize it fully, without rushing into the next thing. My phone buzzed once, a message from Emily confirming the coffee time and location in the morning, and I replied with a simple acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing less, because that was enough. And as I put my phone away, I realized how different even that felt. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, no expectation attached to it, just a straightforward exchange built on something that had not existed before. And I got into my car and started driving, not fast, not slow, just steady, the same way everything had unfolded that night. And as the city passed by outside the window, I thought back to the version of myself from earlier that evening, sitting at that table, hearing that word again, useless. And I did not feel anger toward it anymore, not even frustration. It felt distant now, like something that had belonged to a different context, a different frame that no longer applied, because the truth was it had never actually defined me. It had only defined how they saw me, and that distinction was something I understood completely now. The next morning came quickly, the kind of morning where everything feels sharper, more precise, and I arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes early, choosing a table near the window, not out of habit, but because I liked the way the light came in clear and direct. And when Emily walked in, she spotted me immediately, and there was no hesitation in the way she approached, no performance, no adjustment, just a direct line from the door to the chair across from me. "Morning," she said as she sat down, and I nodded, "Morning." And for a second we just sat there, not awkward, not forced, just quiet, like neither of us was rushing to fill the space with something unnecessary. I looked into your company last night, she said finally, and I could tell from her tone that this was not surface level. She had actually taken the time to understand it. "It is solid," she added. "The model, the positioning, the timing, it all makes sense." And I nodded once, acknowledging it, but not expanding on it, because I did not need to explain it further. She had already done the work to see it. "Why did you not pivot earlier into something more visible?" she asked, and I leaned back slightly, considering that, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to give the right one, because I was not building for visibility. I said I was building for function. Once it worked, visibility followed. And she nodded slowly, like that clicked into place for her, not just as information, but as a different way of approaching things. "I think I missed that," she admitted, and there was no defensiveness in it, just a clear acknowledgement, and I appreciated that more than anything else she could have said, because it meant she was not trying to reinterpret the past to make it easier. She was accepting it as it was. "We all did," I said simply, and she gave a small exhale, almost like a release of something she had been holding onto without realizing it. "Last night," she continued, "when Dad said what he said." She paused there, not finishing the sentence, not needing to, because we both knew exactly what she meant, and I did not interrupt. I let her finish it in her own way. "That was not right," she said, and I nodded once, not because I needed her to say it, but because I recognized the weight of her choosing to, and we sat there for a moment longer, the conversation not heavy, not dramatic, just real and grounded in a way that had never existed between us before. And as the morning moved forward, the conversation shifted naturally into specifics, into ideas, into actual discussion about what I had built and what could come next, not as advice, not as correction, but as collaboration. And I realized then that this was what had been missing all along, not approval, not praise, but understanding. And as I looked across the table at her, I saw not the comparison, not the hierarchy, just another person meeting me where I was, and that was something entirely new. The conversation did not end when the coffee cups emptied. It shifted again, the same way everything had been shifting since the night before, not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something finally moving in the direction it was always supposed to go. Emily leaned back slightly, her hands wrapped around the cup, even though it had already gone cold, and for a moment, she just looked at me, not evaluating, not comparing, just present. I always thought I understood how things worked, she said quietly, like there was a clear path you follow it, you get results, and that is it. And I nodded because I knew exactly what she meant. I had grown up in the same system, the same structure, where everything was supposed to make sense in a straight line. Effort leads to recognition, recognition leads to success, and anything outside of that looked like failure. That works until it does not, I said, and she gave a small nod like. That sentence landed deeper than the others. I think I confused visibility with value, she added after a moment. If I could see it, I believed in it. If I could not, I assumed it was not there. And there was no defensiveness in it, just clarity, and that mattered more than anything else because it meant she was not trying to protect her old perspective. She was willing to let it change. Most people do, I said simply, because that was the truth, not just for her, not just for my family, but for almost everyone. It is easier to trust what is visible, what is already validated, what fits into a framework that feels safe and predictable. And we sat there for a few seconds longer, the conversation not needing to be filled because it was already moving at the right pace. Dad is going to have a hard time with this, she said eventually, and I did not need to ask what she meant. I knew it was not about the deal, it was about the shift, the loss of certainty, the need to adjust something he had relied on for years to define what mattered and what did not. He will figure it out, I said, not as reassurance, but as a statement, because I believed that if he chose to engage with it honestly, he would find his way through it just like anyone else would. And she nodded like she understood that too. He respects results, she said. He just needs time to recalibrate how he sees them. And that made sense to me because I had seen that process start the night before. The pause in his voice, the way he shifted from judgment to observation, and that was where change always began, not in agreement, but in hesitation, the moment where something no longer fit cleanly into the old pattern and had to be reconsidered. Mom already knows, Emily added with a small, almost thoughtful smile. She felt it before she understood it. And I almost smiled at that because it was true. My mom had always responded more to feeling than structure, and even if she could not articulate it right away, she recognized when something real was in front of her. And we let that sit for a moment, both of us aware that this conversation was not something we had ever had before, not because we could not, but because we had never stepped outside of the roles we were given long enough to see each other differently. So what happens now? She asked finally, and it was not a strategic question, not about the business, not about the deal. It was something broader, something more personal, and I took a second before answering, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to say it clearly. Nothing changes, I said, and everything changes. And she let out a quiet breath, almost like a soft laugh. That sounds about right. And I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. The work stays the same, the direction stays the same, but the way we interact, that is what can change if we let it. And she nodded slowly, like she was following each part of that. No more assumptions, she said, and I met her gaze. No more assumptions. And there was something simple and solid in that agreement, not formal, not forced, just understood. And as we stood up to leave the coffee shop, the morning had fully settled in the city, moving at its usual pace, people walking past, cars lining up at the light, everything continuing the way it always did. And yet for me it felt different, not because the world had changed, but because the frame I was seeing it through had. And as we stepped outside, Emily paused for a second, turning slightly toward me. I am glad you did not stop, she said, and I looked at her for a moment longer than usual because that sentence carried weight, not as praise, but as recognition of everything that had led up to this point. Me too, I said simply, and we stood there for one more second before going our separate directions, not with tension, not with expectation, just with a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be built on what we used to assume about each other, but on what we had finally taken the time to see. The rest of the day unfolded without any dramatic shift, no sudden realization, no moment where everything clicked into a perfect resolution. It moved the way real things move, steady, layered, quiet. And I went straight from the coffee shop to my meeting, walking into a conference room where none of what had happened the night before mattered in the way people usually think it would. There was no introduction about the deal, no recognition of the stage, no reference to anything outside of the work itself, just a table, a screen, a set of numbers, and people who wanted to understand how the system functioned and how it could scale. And that was exactly where I was most comfortable, because this was the part that had always been real, not the reaction, not the perception, just the structure of what I had built and how it performed. Walk us through the integration timeline, one of the partners said, and I nodded, pulling up the projections outlining each phase, clearly not rushing, not over-explaining, just presenting it the way it had been designed. And as the conversation moved forward, I could feel that same alignment I had felt the night before, not as a peak, not as something temporary, but as a baseline. This was the work, this was the environment where things made sense based on function, not assumption. And when the meeting ended, it ended simply: a handshake, a follow-up scheduled, no applause, no spotlight, just continuation, and I appreciated that more than anything else because it meant the work stood on its own outside of any single moment. My phone buzzed again as I stepped out into the hallway, a message from my dad, just a short line, "Can we talk later?" And I looked at it for a second, longer than necessary, not because I was unsure, but because I recognized what it represented: not authority, not correction, just a request. And I typed back, "Yeah, I am free this evening." Nothing more, nothing less, because that was enough. The rest of the afternoon passed in a similar rhythm: calls, emails, small decisions that move things forward step by step, and by the time the evening came, I was back in my apartment, the city outside quieter, now the kind of quiet that feels earned after a long day, and my phone rang right on time. I answered without hesitation. "Hey," my dad said, and there was a slight pause after it, not awkward, just measured, like he was choosing how to start. "Hey," I replied, and we stayed there for a second, both of us aware that this was not a typical conversation, not the kind we had had before, not one built on advice or expectation, but something different, something still taking shape. "I've been thinking about last night," he said finally, and I could hear it in his tone, not defensive, not certain, just reflective, and that alone told me more than the words themselves about what I said. He added, and I did not interrupt. I let him continue, because this part mattered, not just what he was going to say, but how he chose to say it. "That was not right," he said, and there was no qualification attached to it, no explanation, no attempt to redirect it into something else, just a clear statement, and I nodded even though he could not see it. "Okay," I said simply, because I was not looking for anything more than that, and he exhaled slightly on the other end, like he had been holding something in place and had finally let it go. "I think I have been looking at things too narrowly," he continued. "I focused on what I could measure quickly, what made sense to me, and I did not give enough space to anything outside of that, and I listened without interrupting, because this was not something I needed to guide, it was something he needed to work through in his own way." "You built something real," he said after a moment, and I did not see it because I was not looking for it in the right way, and there was a pause after that, not empty, but settled, like something had been placed where it belonged. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, and I meant it not as acceptance, not as closure, just as acknowledgement, and he let out a quiet breath. "I would like to understand it better," he said, and I nodded again. "We can talk through it," I said, "but it is not going to fit into the same framework you are used to," and there was a slight shift in his tone, not resistance, just adjustment. "Then I will adjust," he said, and it was simple, but it carried weight because it was not something he said easily, and we stayed on the call a little longer, not diving into details, not turning it into a full discussion, just establishing something that had not been there before, a baseline that did not rely on assumption or hierarchy, but on a willingness to engage. And when we hung up, the room was quiet again, the same quiet as before, but it felt different now, not empty, not transitional, just steady, and I sat there for a moment longer, not replaying anything, not analyzing, just present in the space that had been created, and for the first time I understood something completely. This was not about proving them wrong, it was about no longer needing to. The next few days did not bring anything dramatic. No sudden changes, no visible transformation in how everything worked on the surface, but underneath there was a shift that was hard to ignore, not because it was loud, but because it was consistent. My dad called again 2 days later, not to question, not to correct, but to ask, "Can you walk me through how your system actually works?" And I could hear it in his voice, the difference in approach, the absence of assumption, and I said yes, not because I needed him to understand it, but because I was open to explaining it on terms that made sense. Now we set up a time, and when the call started, he listened more than he spoke, asking questions when something was unclear, not to challenge, but to understand, and for the first time I was not translating my answers into something he would approve of. I was just explaining the reality of it, the structure, the process, the decisions that had shaped everything, and he followed along, not perfectly, not immediately, but steadily, and that mattered more than anything else because it meant he was adjusting, not forcing it back into something familiar. My mom texted me that same week, just a simple message asking how my meetings were going, and it was not unusual in wording, but It felt different in intention. There was no hidden concern, no subtle comparison, just interest, and I responded in the same way, clear, direct, no extra layers, because that was enough. And Emily and I continued meeting for coffee, not every day, not even on a schedule, just when it made sense, and each time the conversation built on the last, not circling back to what had been said before, but moving forward into something that had not existed between us before, discussions about strategy, about scale, about ideas that overlapped in ways we had never explored because we had always been positioned against each other instead of alongside. And I noticed something in those conversations, the absence of competition, not because we were avoiding it, but because it no longer applied in the same way. We were not measuring ourselves against each other. We were looking at what could be built from where we both stood, and that changed the dynamic completely. I used to think we were on the same track, she said one afternoon, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, like it was just a matter of who got further faster. And I nodded, because that was exactly how it had been framed for us growing up, a single path with limited space and constant comparison, but we were building completely different things. She added, and there was clarity in her voice now, not uncertainty, and I leaned back slightly, letting that settle, because it was true. We had never been on the same path. We had just been placed in the same narrative and expected to compete within it, and now that narrative no longer held the same weight. The following week, my dad asked if he could visit the office, not as an inspection, not as a review, but as a guest, and I agreed, setting a time that worked for both of us. And when he arrived, he did not walk in with authority. He walked in with attention, taking in the space, the people, the way everything operated. And I walked him through it step by step, not simplifying, not adjusting, just showing him exactly how it functioned. And he listened, asking questions when needed, observing more than speaking. And at one point, he paused, looking at one of the dashboards tracking real-time data across multiple clients. "This is efficient," he said. And it was a simple statement, but it carried recognition, not of the outcome, but of the system itself, and I nodded. That was the goal. And he looked at me then, not evaluating, not comparing, just acknowledging, and in that moment I saw it clearly. The shift was not in what I had built that had been there all along. The shift was in how it was being seen, and more importantly, how it was being approached. And when he left, he did not offer advice, he did not suggest changes, he just said, "Thank you for showing me." And that was enough, because it meant he understood something that had not been accessible to him before. And as I closed the office door behind him, I stood there for a second, not reflecting, not analyzing, just recognizing that this was what change actually looked like, not immediate, not perfect, but consistent and grounded in something real. And as I turned back to my desk, picking up where I had left off, I knew that whatever came next would not depend on whether they fully understood everything, yet it would continue because it was already built. To weeks passed, and nothing about the outside world slowed down. The work kept moving forward, new clients, new integrations, new problems that needed solving, and I stayed focused on that, not because I was avoiding anything else, but because that was where everything had always made sense. And what changed was not the pace of my life, but the way certain moments started to feel. The next time I went home, it was not for a holiday, not for an event, just a regular Sunday afternoon, the kind that used to feel heavier than it should have because of everything unspoken. But this time it was different, not completely transformed, not perfect, but noticeably different. My mom opened the door with the same warmth she always had, but without the undercurrent of concern that used to sit behind it. "Hey," she said with a small smile, and I nodded, stepping inside. "Hey." And for a moment it felt simple, just that, just two people greeting each other without anything layered underneath. And my dad was in the living room, looking up as I walked in, not with that usual quick evaluation, but with a steady acknowledgement. "You made it," he said, and I nodded. "Yeah," and we did not jump into anything immediately. We sat down, the television on in the background, low volume, something playing that none of us were really watching, and that silence that used to feel tense now felt neutral, like it did not need to be filled right away. "I have been thinking about what you said," my dad started after a few minutes, and I looked over at him, not anticipating, not bracing, just listening. "About things not fitting into the same framework," he continued, and I nodded slightly because I remembered exactly what he meant. "I realized something," he said. "I have always valued things I could understand quickly, things that followed a pattern I knew how to measure." And he paused there, not for effect, but because he was working through it as he said it, and I assumed that if something did not fit, that it was not working. And I did not interrupt, because that was his realization, not something I needed to guide or correct. "That was my mistake," he added, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften it, just a clear statement. And I nodded. "Once it happens," I said simply, because it did not need to be turned into anything bigger than it was. My mom sat down across from us, listening quietly, and then she added something in her own way. I think we were waiting to understand it before we supported it, she said, instead of supporting it while you were building it. And I looked at her for a second longer than usual, because that sentence carried a kind of honesty that had not been present before, not defensive, not explained away, just acknowledged. Yeah, I said, that is exactly what it felt like, and she nodded slowly like she accepted that fully. Without needing to adjust it, we should have asked more questions, she said, and I did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to soften. It was simply true, and it did not need to be rewritten. We can start now, I said after a moment, and both of them nodded, not quickly, not performatively, just steadily, like they understood that this was not about catching up all at once, but about moving forward differently. And we talked not about the deal, not about the numbers, but about the process, about how things had developed, the choices that had been made, the risks that had been taken. And for the first time the conversation stayed there. It did not shift into comparison. It did not get redirected into something familiar. It remained exactly where it was supposed to be. And that was new. Later that afternoon, Emily stopped by unannounced, walking in with that same energy she always had, but without the edge that used to come with it. I figured you would be here, she said as she dropped her keys on the table, and I nodded. Yeah, and she joined us, sitting down naturally, like she was part of the same conversation, not stepping into it from a different position. So, what are you working on now? She asked, and it was straightforward, no setup, no assumption, just a question, and I answered the same way, and the conversation continued building from there, not as a correction of the past, but as something new entirely. And as I sat there listening, responding, engaging without adjusting myself to fit into anything else, I realized something that settled in deeper than any moment before. This was not about changing their minds, it was about changing the way we interacted, and that had already begun, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. And as the afternoon moved into evening, and the light outside shifted gradually, I stood up to leave, not because I needed to escape, but because I had somewhere else to be. And my dad walked me to the door, not out of habit, but with intention. I am glad you came by, he said, and I nodded, me too. And my mom hugged me lightly, not holding on, not making it into a moment, just a simple gesture. And Emily gave me a small nod as I stepped out, and as I walked to my car, I did not feel like anything had been resolved. I felt like something had been reset, and that difference mattered, because resolution ends things, and this was not an ending. It was the beginning of something that had never been allowed to exist before, and now finally had the space to. The days continued to move forward, not in a straight line, but in a steady rhythm that no longer depended on how anyone else interpreted it. And what I noticed most was not what had changed externally, but what no longer needed to be managed internally. There was no second layer of translation, no constant adjustment to fit into expectations that had already been proven incomplete. The work expanded naturally, new partnerships forming, new systems being tested and refined, and I stayed focused on that, because that was the foundation. Everything else now built around instead of the other way around. And every once in a while there would be a moment that reminded me how far that shift had actually gone, not in a dramatic way, just small interactions that would have felt different before, like when my dad called one afternoon, not to question or advise, but to share something he had been working on at his own company, a process they were trying to optimize, and instead of explaining it from a place of authority, he asked, "How would you approach this?" And I paused for a second, not because I did not have an answer, but because I recognized what that question represented. It was not about the problem, it was about the way he was now choosing to engage, and I answered directly, walking him through how I would structure it, what variables I would prioritize, what I would test first. And he listened without interrupting, without redirecting, and when I finished there was a brief silence on the line, not empty, just thoughtful. "That makes sense," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no need to reshape it into something else, and that was enough. The next time I visited the house, it was quieter than usual, not in a heavy way, just calm, the kind of calm that does not need to be filled, and we sat at the same table where everything had shifted weeks earlier, but it felt like a different space now, not because the table had changed, but because the dynamic around it had. And my mom placed a plate in front of me the same way she always had, but without that subtle tension that used to accompany even the smallest interactions. "I tried that recipe you mentioned," she said as she sat down. "It worked exactly the way you said it would," and I nodded, "Good." And we moved on from it naturally, not turning it into anything more than it was, just a simple exchange built on something real. And Emily joined a few minutes later, sitting across from me, pulling out her notebook almost automatically. "I've been thinking about that expansion model you mentioned," she said. "There might be a way to apply it to a different sector." And we talked through it not as a debate, not as a comparison, just a shared problem-solving process, building on ideas instead of positioning them against each other. And my dad listened for a while before adding something of his own, not as a correction, but as an extension of what we were already discussing, and I could see it clearly now the way the conversation moved, the way each piece connected without friction, without the need to establish who was right or who was ahead, and that was new, not perfect, not permanent, but real. And as we sat there, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else. This was not about rewriting the past, it was about no longer carrying it forward in the same way the memory of that night was still there. The words still existed, but they no longer held the same weight, because they were no longer reinforced by everything that followed. They had been replaced, not erased, replaced by new interactions, new patterns, new ways of engaging that did not support the same conclusion. And that changed everything, because it meant that the narrative had shifted not by force, not by argument, but by consistency over time. And when I stood up to leave later that evening, my dad walked me to the door again. And this time there was no pause, no hesitation. "Let me know when you are in town next," he said. "I would like to see what you are working on then." And I nodded. "I will." And my mom gave me a quick hug, Emily a small nod. And as I stepped outside, the air felt the same as it always did, the street the same, the house the same. But the way I moved through it was different, not because I was trying to be different, but because I no longer needed to adjust to something that did not fit. And as I got into my car, I did not think about what had been said that night or how it had changed. I thought about what was next, the meetings, the systems, the work that continued to build forward without interruption. And I understood something completely. Now this was not about the moment on the stage or the reaction at the table. It was about everything that came after, the way things continued, the way they evolved, the way they no longer depended on proving anything to anyone. And as I started the engine and pulled away, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what they once believed, but by what I had already built and continued to build. Regardless, the next morning felt no different from any other. And that was the point. There was no dramatic shift, no sense of arrival, just the quiet continuation of something that had already been set in motion, and I moved through it the same way I always had, focused, steady, clear. And as I sat at my desk reviewing the next set of projections, adjusting timelines, refining systems, I realized that the moment on that stage had never been the peak, it had been a checkpoint, one that confirmed what I already knew but did not define what came next. And that distinction mattered more than anything else, because it meant I was no longer building toward recognition, I was building from it, and that changed the direction entirely. My phone buzzed again, a message from my mom, a simple question about when I would be visiting next, and I replied with a time that worked, not adjusting, not hesitating, just responding. And a few seconds later, my dad sent a short note about an idea he wanted my input on, and Emily followed with a quick update on something she was exploring that connected to what we had discussed. And I looked at those messages for a moment, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were consistent, and consistency was what had been missing before. Not effort, not intention, just the ability to stay aligned over time. And now that alignment was there, not perfect, not complete, but real. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that settle, not as something I needed to analyze, but as something I could simply recognize. This was what change actually looked like, not a single moment, not a single conversation, but a series of small adjustments that built into something stable. And as I turned back to my screen, continuing the work that had always been at the center of everything, I understood something clearly that had taken years to fully form. I had never been what they called me that night, and more importantly, I no longer needed to prove that to anyone, because the work itself had already done it, and would continue to do it long after any single moment had passed. And as the day moved forward, calls, meetings, decisions, all flowing in the same steady rhythm, I felt something that was both simple and complete, not relief, not validation, just clarity, the kind that does not need to be defended or explained, because it exists independently of anything else. And that clarity stayed with me, not just in the quiet moments, but in every interaction, every choice, every step forward, because it was no longer tied to how I was seen. It was rooted in what I had built and who I had become through it. And as I paused for a moment, looking out the window at the city moving in its usual rhythm, I thought about that night not as a turning point, but as a contrast, a clear line between what had been assumed and what was actually real. And that line no longer felt heavy, it felt necessary, because without it I might not have seen the difference as clearly as I do now. And that is what this whole experience really comes down to: not proving someone wrong, not winning a moment, not reversing a narrative, but understanding that people often see you through the limits of their own perspective, and if you accept that as truth, you will shrink to fit it. But if you keep building quietly, consistently, without needing immediate recognition, you create something that eventually speaks for itself, not in a way that forces others to change, but in a way that gives them the chance to, and that is where real connection begins, not in agreement, not in validation, but in understanding. And that understanding does not come from a single moment, it comes from showing up again and again with something real until it can no longer be ignored. And when that happens, the people who are willing to see it will adjust, not because they have to, but because they finally can, and the ones who do not will stay where they are. And that is okay, because your direction no longer depends on either outcome. And if there is anything to take from this, it is this: do not measure your worth by how quickly others recognize it. Measure it by how consistently you build something that remains true even when no one is watching. Because in the end, it is not the moment of recognition that changes everything. It is the work you did before it that made that moment possible, and the way you continue after it that gives it meaning. And maybe that is what matters most, not that they finally saw me, but that I never stopped seeing myself, even when it would have been easier to believe them. And that is where everything really begins, not in what others say, but in what you choose to keep building regardless.